Good morning, everyone. Right, so what we're doing today, we're going to look at the yellow wallpaper, and this fits in two different ways. We've looked at a couple of other wider reading bits, but the reason why it's so important to look at these is kind of twofold. A, the wider reading wants to be worked in within your other American lit answers. So when you're talking about Gatsby, you should be looking to how other wider American literature also kind of either fits with what Gatsby's doing or it kind of goes against what Gatsby's doing. So how there are differences to it as well. It's also important in the more wider reading you look at, the more that you kind of explore the wider reading, you think about the kind of implications, how that wider reading is dealing with the context, the stronger you're also going to be when you get that extract of unseen literature as well. Because in that extract of unseen, obviously it's the same kind of principles as you've been applying to your wider reading. You're looking at it, you're trying to think how it's reflecting the kind of context, the time period, how it's kind of exploring the kind of American ideals and how it's constructing its literature to go with that. So with the yellow wallpaper, okay, so in terms of the kind of plan for today, the first thing that we need to do is kind of contextualize this. So place her as an author within her time frame and think about the kind of wider context to which she's part of in terms of kind of American literature at that point in time. So once we've done that, we can then move into kind of actually reading through the text and thinking about kind of central questions in terms of the depiction of women and the kind of central symbolism within the text. So obviously it's called the yellow wallpaper. The yellow wallpaper itself is kind of an extended motif that runs through it. So looking at that. Then at the end, I've got a kind of a comparison point into Gatsby. And with that kind of comparison point into Gatsby, pardon me, it's not based on a specific question. It's sort of more generalized. But if you start to think about these kind of comparisons in advance, then you can tailor those two questions as you go into the actual exam, and it shows you the kind of format, what they're kind of expecting. And I've got some suggestions as to how you could kind of do an extension on this and construct your own points of kind of comparison as well. Okay, so before anything else, we need to have a look at Gilman, and you need to find out a little bit about her. So we need to think around her actual life, so that kind of biographical background. We need to think about her writing, her views, how those are kind of expressed and brought in. Then you need to think not just her specifically, but how she's fitting into the kind of wider framework of kind of the women's movement at the time, what's kind of going on in relation to that. And finally, I just want you to make sure you found out exactly what it means by kind of the idea of the rest cure in relation to kind of mental health practices, medical practices, what kind of it means by this, because this is something else that's kind of central to her here and her kind of views and perspectives. Okay, so in terms of that kind of wider biography for herself, she comes from kind of a poverty-stricken background in that her father leaves the family when she is quite young and leaves her with a mother sort of unable to support her. She's got a number of kind of relatives around her who kind of her aunts, one of them is a suffragette, one of them is a sort of author. So she's kind of got a kind of disjointed background in terms of that. Her first marriage, which is at the point that she writes the yellow wallpaper, is not a happy marriage. She has one child with Gilman, and then kind of it's her own mental health declines, and she is kind of subjected herself to what's referred to as the rest cure, whereby in order to kind of make people better, you kind of literally confine them and say, we don't do anything, you basically just rest all the time. So she kind of is forced into this world with a kind of lack of mental stimulation and help alongside. And in terms of her kind of wider views, people looking back on her, you're probably going to find that as you read around it, you're quite kind of conflicted around her, potentially depending on how much you read. Her views around kind of women in the home are quite progressive. She is, looking at the way in which these set gender roles are no longer necessary, that they are a kind of social construction, that women have been kind of historically confined within this. She does have some rather alarming views around race, though. They're not explored in the Yellow Wallpaper, but these are far less progressive and essentially they're incredibly racist. So it's a conflicted view that people have around her, in that she's kind of, in terms of feminism, she's seen as sort of a real kind of archetype, somebody to look to. But in terms of her kind of race ideas, they are incredibly destructive, essentially, and not something that you want to kind of focus around in any way, shape, or form. So as we kind of move forwards, okay, sorry, cut out there slightly. So in relation to this, I've given you a copy of the Yellow Wallpaper as a PDF with the email. I've also sent a set of questions. I think there's 16 of them that go with it. Now, it is a short story. It's not terribly long. It's probably only going to take you kind of 20, 30 minutes to kind of read through it and look at the questions alongside and kind of highlight the bits of evidence that you need alongside as well. Maybe a little bit long, maybe 40 minutes at most, though. So what I want you to do, I want you to read through the questions first, okay, so that you know what you're looking for as you actually read through. So these are the first 5 questions, the rest are on the sheet. So read through those questions, work out what you are looking for. Then as you read through the short story, you should be kind of looking to answer those questions, highlighting bits of relevant evidence that go with it as well. So in terms of doing that, some of the questions are roughly in kind of a chronological order in relation to the text. Having said that, for some of them, they're open enough that you might come back to them with later bits of evidence. So if I just take, for example, the third question there, how is the narrative voices powerlessness against the men in her life implied in the narrative? That's something you might pick up on early on and kind of develop on later on and add in kind of bits of evidence and answers to that as you kind of go through the text, okay? So at this point, you want to kind of pause me, turn me off for now, and use the questions and the text, read through, work through that. When you've done that, I'll go through some of the kind of key points again. I won't be picking out every word, but we'll get a kind of general answer to each question, something that we can then kind of work through, okay? So pause me there. Okay, so we want to start looking at the kind of text itself. Now, you don't necessarily need more evidence for the first one, but it does what a lot of texts at the time do, in that it looks at the kind of the sources of kind of patriarchal confinement. And here we've got the kind of ordinary people, and they are taken to this setting that they wouldn't normally be part of necessarily, kind of a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate. And I would say that the implication of this, the kind of government wants to draw out of the narrative, is the sources of women's confinement can be linked back to these kind of older belief structures, that they're not necessarily as relevant in this kind of modern time. They reflect something kind of different here, okay? And you're seeing a kind of changing America at the time. So it kind of links into the second question, whereby you get the kind of description. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. So the text isn't just about kind of women and women's suffrage. It's also kind of about the way in which America is changing. So from that kind of faith, and it's often seen as kind of founded on a religious basis. If you look right back, there's a kind of belief in kind of fate and kind of destiny. America is changing into something more kind of practical. It shows that kind of transformation into something more kind of almost utilitarian, and something more kind of cold, essentially. America is changing into something more purely scientific, and kind of it fits in with that wider kind of mechanization and industrialization that comes in here. Okay. Now, in terms of the kind of the initial implication here, in terms of that kind of powerlessness against the men in her life implied, she's kind of characterizing here. John is a doctor, so is her kind of brother. So there's a kind of gap in terms of education, in terms of kind of social positioning here. And she kind of questions, if you look on to kind of down to the second page, a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. What is one to do? So her rhetorical question here implies that, well, her voice counts far less than the voice of her husband here. It's both the fact that he is the husband and in the male role that's important. It's also the fact that he's a doctor, he's a physician, he has this high social standing that she lacks. So her voice counts far less than his voice counts for. Okay, so it then kind of develops this, and it's got the kind of the mirroring with the brother. My brother is also a physician, the high social standing. He says the same things, and despite the fact that it kind of goes down, and personally I disagree with their ideas. She's kind of clearly placed in the kind of subservient position, and she's kind of confined and constrained because of this. Okay, so with the fourth question, think back to kind of Gatsby's house and the way that that's kind of depicted, and even kind of Tom and Daisy's houses. Now, they're all set in the United States. The United States is supposed to be this kind of breakaway and new place, and yet all of these houses seem to imitate in some way, shape, or form the kind of European houses. So Gatsby's house is this kind of absurd kind of castle-like structure, this Hotel de Normandy, and this kind of attempt to mimic the old kind of aristocracy. And the Yellow Wallpaper as well is set in the US, obviously, and yet this kind of home, this kind of hereditary estate that they're staying on, it also seems to mirror back to the kind of European. So you get the fact that it makes me think of English places that you read about. There are hedges, walls, gates. So within that upper class in America, it reflects that same kind of idea that they are trying to reflect older class structures, that they are, simply repeating ideas that come before, and kind of trying to create kind of a continuity almost between themselves and this kind of original state. Okay, so as we kind of go into the next one, you want to think the narrative starts to introduce all these kind of controls being placed on her. The fact that she's kind of dictated which room she's going to kind of stay in. Every aspect of her day is dictated to her. The kind of the prescriptions, the medications, all dictated to her. And there is a sense of kind of frustration coming through this. She does talk, and if we look on to kind of, it's the third page, but it's page 5 at the bottom of it. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. I never used to, where I can't find it now. Hang on a second. Okay, yeah, sorry, it's there at the top of the page. I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. So there's this sense that we've got a first person narrator here, and as she views her own behavior, she sees any kind of, rejection of him as being unreasonable. And as it goes down, I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. So the implication here is that she's been taught to kind of not enjoy, but to accept and be grateful for the control that men kind of place upon her. And where she kind of feels confined by that, the narrative evokes a sense of kind of guilt and a sense of wrongness about her own behavior, in that it kind of runs counter to seemingly what it should be. So it's implied that she's been kind of taught to act in this kind of specific way. Now, okay. So the first and most significant thing is that she places her narrative voice in the nursery itself. So it sort of suggests that she is being infantized, that she is being kind of treated in the same way as the child is, essentially. And then if you kind of consider the wider setting of the room as kind of Gilman presents it, there's a sense of kind of the prison that goes with it. You get the reference to the kind of the barred windows, the rings on the wall, which kind of evokes a sort of a prison or a dungeon of some form. And then the wallpaper itself, and the fact that it's kind of its patterns evoke something kind of damaging and worrying to our kind of narrative voice here. There's the references to the kind of trace and suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, the kind of repellent colour, the smouldering unclean, and then the kind of sulphur tint to it. So this is a room that in some ways is kind of attractive. It does talk about the kind of the windows, the size of it, but at the same time it's still a kind of prison here, and there's still a kind of disturbing and distorting nature to this that reflects onto the way in which she is treated as well. There's sort of this sort of seeming imagery of freedom, but at the same time it's more literally a prison, and there's something disturbing about the image as a whole. Okay, then the narrative seems to kind of build on this idea of the kind of the rest cure, and she's kind of depicted here. She's kind of don't do anything. There's this sense of guilt as it kind of transitions between him. I must put this away. John can't see that I'm writing, because to be doing anything at all is sort of supposedly going to kind of damage her recovery. And there's this kind of development it goes through that this is actually kind of counterproductive, that the narrative voice would feel better if it were allowed to do things, that this rest cure is not effective. So you get that metaphor, it does weigh on me, so not to do my duty in any way. And it's exclamatory. There's a sense that actually this is adding to the kind of burdens that she feels. It's making it seem more kind of damaging here. Even the childcare is taken away from her. You get Mary in here who's looking after the child as part of it. Which other bits do I want? Hang on. Okay, so there are other bits. There are bits sort of that suggest that she wished at some point this kind of ideal of the marriage. I meant to be such a help to John. So she's kind of been denied these kind of aspirational ideas, and the whole kind of denial of being able to write as well, as a kind of form of self-expression. Now, that kind of suggests the kind of counterproductive nature to the rest cure. And it's John that's kind of pushing this as a kind of rest cure, is the implication. He's the physician, he's advising this. And there is the implication that he's not doing this in a kind of vindictive way, and it turns into this kind of wider suggestion that men at this point in history are not necessarily aware of the way in which they're kind of imposing, that they are kind of destructive in this kind of fashion. So John here, we get this kind of repeated idea that, oh, he's very loving. You get John does not know how much I really suffer. You get, then he took me in his arms and called me his blessed little goose. So there's this sense that she's entrapped, but it's not kind of in a purposeful way. That it's not a torture being imposed. Well, it is a torture, but it's not being done purposefully to torture. That it simply comes from a kind of a root of misunderstanding between the kind of two genders here. Okay, so just to kind of build up on the bit before, you get her kind of desire coming into this to have people around her, to have this kind of stimulating conversation. But John and the kind of image here, he would as soon put fireworks in my pillowcase. So this belief that by doing it, he would be creating something destructive. But the implication that we get as a reader is that actually this would help her, this would kind of open up her world to her again. So it's about kind of presenting this. Now, as the narrative progresses, you get the intensification of the kind of the disturbance caused by the wallpaper. It's increasingly made to seem kind of, disturbing to her. So the nursery itself, you get the kind of imagery where she's looking out the windows. This is in many ways very much like the story of an hour that we looked at, where there's all this kind of imagery of nature beyond and this kind of, things to look out to. And yet within the kind of the confines of the nursery, the wallpaper is kind of increasingly starting to disturb this kind of sense of equilibrium. So you get kind of, we've already had it kind of the suicide image, the kind of the jumping image, but as it kind of goes through, there's a recurrent spot where the pattern lolls like a broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. So this kind of imagery of execution comes into it. It's increasingly made to seem quite kind of disturbing here. Which other bits do I want to point out? Hang on. Yeah, so there's an increasing sense of kind of life given to it as well. So we start to kind of personify it. It becomes a more, living presence within the room. So you get the eyes that kind of continue and they're looking out, they're unblinking eyes everywhere. There's something kind of watching and kind of searching. And it's the kind of incongruity of this as wallpaper as well. The fact it doesn't match. There's something kind of disturbing in this image. It doesn't kind of, there's no order to it as well. Okay, so gradually within this we get the kind of the emergence of the figure that's going to come through later on, and you get the kind of idea that there's something almost living behind the wallpaper. So as we go further through, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to skulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design, and where initially this is kind of formless. This is going to kind of solidify into the kind of female figure as it kind of goes further through. Okay, sorry, I didn't keep kind of picking up on bits that kind of I forget as it kind of goes through. So as the kind of the narrative progresses, we get this sense the narrative voice is becoming increasingly kind of obsessive around the kind of the wallpaper, and the kind of the length of the descriptions lengthens, and the way she's kind of following the pattern, and again that heightens the sense of disturbance that kind of goes with it, and again it kind of the seeming inconsistencies that she kind of highlights. She talks about kind of she knows something of design, and yet she doesn't kind of understand the patterning here, how it's kind of been put together. Okay, so as the narrative kind of progresses, it kind of moves into questions kind of 10 here, starts to kind of come into light, where you do get these kind of suggestions here that this confinement, this kind of treatment, the kind of treatment of women as a whole is linked to a kind of a male selfishness that, so if you look kind of, it's on page 13 or page 11, depending on how you're looking at it. I must take care of myself for his sake, not for her own sake, but for his sake. So you get this as kind of, it's repeated a couple of times, I think, as it goes through, that it's about his welfare, that her kind of health rests, that there is this kind of selfish element to it in terms of the way that it's kind of depicted. Okay, as we then kind of go further through, our kind of last set of questions here, thinking around the kind of the woman that the narrative voice begins to see behind the kind of wallpaper. Okay, so as the kind of narrative progresses, there's this increasing certainty in the narrative voice that what she sees behind the wallpaper is actually a kind of a woman, this kind of female form, and it's at night time that this becomes more obvious to her in the light of the moonlight. And the moon is typically seen as this kind of feminized object. We've had it where it's kind of, pardon me, linked into kind of the menstrual cycle and things like this. So the moon we've talked about in terms of Plath, I kind of seen this link in here. So during the daytime, where there's this kind of seeming light, she can't make any real sense of the wallpaper, but at night time it seems to become more obvious to her. And behind the wallpaper is this woman, this kind of woman who's trapped within it. And in many ways, in terms of kind of a symbolic view, this is more a kind of reflection of her own realizations occurring here. She talks about, well, she understands things about the wallpaper that nobody else does, nobody else ever will. So it's about this kind of growing realization within her of her own entrapment that's potentially seen reflected in the wallpaper. Okay, now with that next question, that should be why. I apologise for that. On the sheet, I've changed it to why, but it's difficult to change it now without losing half recording here. So why does Gilman present the kind of narrative's voice health as improving as she seems to understand more about the wallpaper? Well, the implication is that, yes, there's a kind of manic quality to it, but this kind of growing understanding gives a kind of a sense of self-assurance that there's that realization of kind of her link into the woman behind the wall. This growing understanding is in a sense empowering to women. The more that they understand this, the greater their kind of health becomes in a kind of, you know, in a wider sense. It's meant as kind of something more symbolic, and whilst other people may look on it as a kind of madness, it's actually kind of for them something kind of more empowering as part of it. So hang on. Okay, so increasingly the woman behind the wallpaper and our narrative voice kind of become one, and there are various ways in which Gilman kind of does this. So you get this kind of sensory experience coming through, and the smell is something that seems to kind of be drawn out. So before it was very visual in terms of the wallpaper, now we get the kind of the olfactory sense coming into it, and this odor, this smell, it gets into my hair, it says. It follows her around the house. So you get this kind of increasing connection between her and the kind of wallpaper coming into it. And then, hang on, let me find the next bit. Okay, so she starts to kind of talk about this woman that she sees around, and she talks about this woman that she sees kind of creeping by daylight, and it starts kind of, so beyond the smell, there's further kind of parallels. Think about the way she's described her own behaviors, the way that she herself is having to kind of hide her own writing, the fact that she is watched and is creeping in the daylight herself, and then this woman too is kind of creeping in the daylight. Um, so I always lock the door when I creep by daylight. So there's a parallel here in terms of the behaviors of both of these women, and it then kind of feeds into the fact that both of them are confined, and you get the kind of shaking of the bars of this woman behind the wallpaper, and this kind of horrific image of kind of entrapment. Okay, so we then get the kind of, as it kind of progresses and the kind of general narrative plot progresses, they're going to leave the house soon. And one of the things that happens within that kind of, as the plot, is that the room is then cleared again. So the furniture is moved out of the room. Now, there's a kind of symbolism that goes with this as well, that the furniture has served to at least partially obscure what's happening in the room, partially obscure the wallpaper and the images of kind of entrapment. And with its removal, everything becomes more kind of clearly exposed again. So if you could kind of have a look. Anyway, sorry, I just had an email come through I had to quickly look at. So yeah, as it goes through, I quite enjoy the room now it is bare again, because it exposes kind of the things that are hidden from her before, and that have been obscured. So if we take this as kind of a wider symbolic implication, it's that these kind of domestic objects, these domestic things, often obscure to people the reality of what's going on. So there's a kind of symbolism here in terms of how those kind of furniture items, those domestic objects, have made it less clear to women the way in which they're being entrapped. They serve to kind of reflect this difference here. And you do get this increasing insanity. So we're kind of moving into question 15 here. There's, the image that she's brought a rope up with her. She's going to tie up this woman as she releases them. She's locked herself in. And again, there's a symbolism that goes with this, that, a societal expectation of women would see this as kind of insanity, this recognition, this sort of supposed idea that they're entrapped. It would say that, no, you're not, this is simply natural. So that's the kind of expectation she's working against. And these see her as kind of insane here. They reflect her as kind of, just simply, it's an insane notion that she's trying to kind of challenge here. So her insanity becomes kind of an emblem of this, and the way society potentially sees her. Now, as we then move into the kind of closing of the narrative, this is another interesting point, another way you kind of draw parallels into the other texts, not necessarily just about kind of the role of women and things, but the way in which endings are created. So at the ending of Gatsby, it's kind of anticlimactic. There's a kind of triumph to Gatsby, but there's also a defeat. There's the kind of isolation of him at the end there. And here it's a kind of ambiguous ending as well. So as we kind of come towards the ending, there is this kind of release. There is the kind of tearing down of the wallpaper, and this kind of seeming recognition within our narrative voice. And the husband kind of fainted on the floor, and her kind of release, she's having to kind of creep over him. But at the same time, there's something kind of deeply disturbing about this as well, in the way in which she's kind of reduced to this state of kind of insanity, that there's something kind of manic within it. So it's an ambiguous ending. It's, on one level it's triumph, but in another level it's kind of, she's caved into something far more manic than at the start, and she's kind of, it's something self-destructive in this as well. Oh, sorry. The other last thing to note there, the kind of final parallel between herself and the woman behind the wallpaper. I pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back now. It's no longer the woman behind the wallpaper. She herself in this voice is identifying herself with the woman behind the wallpaper. And she is the one who's been released by kind of tearing down this wallpaper that has itself served as kind of bars and a prison, in terms of this kind of recognition. Okay, so what we then get, so we then need to kind of think about how this is kind of linking into Gatsby, and further down the line, you would potentially link it into the Grapes of Wrath. So pause it a moment and just have a quick read through my kind of point here. As I say, there's no specific question that underlies it, but what I'm aiming to do is simply show that kind of style that goes with it. So the fact that I'm creating a kind of explicit link into Gatsby, or potentially down the line to Grapes of Wrath, that I'm trying to link this to the kind of overall narrative techniques and give just a little bit of evidence from the Yellow Wallpaper that goes in with it. Okay, so hopefully you've kind of had a proper read through, so I'll just point out kind of some of the things that I'm aiming to kind of do here. So I'm pointing out that it's a similarity to Fitzgerald, that both of them explore this kind of increasing consciousness of women of their confinement and control. So I'm essentially showing that as parallel into kind of Daisy and to Jordan potentially. I then start to talk around the Yellow Wallpaper, specifically this unnamed narrative voice, that they recognize their kind of symbolism and the infantization. I draw back into Gatsby and show there's a difference here, that for Daisy, she recognizes her oppression but wishes ignorance, whereas in the Yellow Wallpaper, and I should have italicized the Yellow Wallpaper there, I apologize, actually kind of revels in this newfound knowledge and that they can no longer be put back. And I look at the kind of the ambiguity of the ending there. So that's my kind of style model. The other thing I would think would be really useful to you, and I'd like you to do today, there are other ways in which you could kind of draw out parallels or differences here. So you could do a paragraph that shows how in the Yellow Wallpaper there's potentially parallels and differences between Tom and the kind of husband figure here. You could look at the narrative voice of Nick, and they kind of compare to the female narrative voice here. You could compare more into Jordan, to the kind of female narrative voice, and kind of Jordan as being a kind of flapper. You could focus in on the kind of double standards. You could look at the emerging freedoms for women, and you could look at the way in which, overall any kind of ideas of progress are very often viewed by at least certain groups within society as destructive. So it doesn't have to be kind of, here you might look at women's progress being kind of collocated with insanity, whereas you might look at kind of other views of social progress in Gatsby, the rise of the new rich being seen as destructive, the kind of criminality. So it doesn't have to be an exact parallel here. I want you to kind of pick one of them, or you could choose something different. That's not an entire list. There are other things you could do. Have a go at using the paragraph from before to kind of draw in your own paragraph, to start thinking about the ways in which you could link this wider reading into your kind of textual knowledge here. Okay, so that's all I want you to do. Have a go at doing that. So pause it here for a moment. Have a go at drafting out a point that would go with this, okay, but with a different kind of slant to it. Okay, now this is kind of setting up for next week at the end here. So we've looked at kind of another short story today. So we've kind of looked at a story of an hour. We've looked at the Yellow Wallpaper. We looked at a bit of the Wasteland when we were doing Gatsby. Can't remember off the top of my head whether I did Death of a Salesman with you while I was doing Gatsby. That's something I'll follow up with. It's definitely something we'll work in down the line. But what they're going to expect from you in the long term is that, as well as things like the short stories, you've also touched on kind of longer narratives as well. So the lesson next week, I'm going to use Native Son by Richard Wright. If you basically just Google Native Son full text, there are multiple kind of full text copies of it, so you don't need to go out and buy it. But I'm just going to look at the first chapter of that next week. And then hopefully it's one that you might find interesting and go out and read a sort of a slightly more, well, read the whole thing essentially. So as a follow-up to this lesson, what I'd recommend you do is that you go out and you read that first chapter between now and next week, just to kind of set you up. And if you want to go beyond that first chapter, go for it. You need to get this kind of wider reading in between now and the exam, though. Okay.